Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Digital Media Zone, where we're very privileged to have with us this evening two of the representatives of one of the key sponsoring partners, Germany. We have Ingrid Hoven, who's the Director General in the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as BMZ, and Karsten Sach, who's also Director General, but in the Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, known as BMU. We're going to talk today a little bit about Innovate for Climate and to get some views from them. So Innovate for Climate is largely about innovative approaches to the climate challenges. So Ingrid, it might be useful if you could talk a little bit about innovative activities and actions that we can take to ensure that we can help poor people deal with extreme weather conditions. What kinds of innovations are you working on? What kinds of things are we dealing with? Because in the end, climate change is about ensuring that people's lives are better, in particular poor people.
This is a very important area because we know that economic losses due to extreme weather events have actually tripled since 1980, which means that we are actually about to lose the gains of the development assistance that we have provided over the last couple of years. And we see an increasing actually workload of the humanitarian assistance because what we do normally that we come in after a extreme weather event has hit a poor country and then we try to give an assistance, but this is just once at a time. We try to, together with the World Bank and other partners, we try to step up investments in resilience, in preparedness, because many studies show that actually if you invest €1 in preparedness action, like adaptation plans, you build up dams, you try to make sure that the forests don't erode. If you do this type of preparedness action, you can save €4 in economic terms, which means that it's much more, in economic terms, but also in humanitarian aspects, it's much clever and much smarter to invest in preparedness action. So how do you get actually developing countries to invest in preparedness action, such as adaptation to climate change? And one of the pilots that we are now scaling up is actually to invest much more in forecast-based financing, in disaster risk finance modeling, bringing in the private sector, for instance, through insurance schemes. How does this work, for instance? A country like Niger, they might buy insurance policy. And this insurance policy promises that if an extreme weather event hits a country like a drought, a trigger is reached and then a payout out of the insurance schemes reaches the country. And it reaches the country much quicker than any humanitarian assistance. So you could say, well, this is not very innovative. And now the private sector comes in. Because in order to reach more people, what we are going to be using the private sector to reinsure the risk of a specific country. So insurance models actually provide a vehicle to create solidarity among countries. You share risk among more countries, and at the same time you can use the capital of the insurance industry to scale up action. The protection shield that we can build for poor and vulnerable people. The World Bank, for instance, has a lot of expertise in this type of financial engineering, and we try to build up more sovereign risk pools, as we call those mechanisms. We have started to work in Africa, in the Pacific, and in the Caribbean region, and it has proved to be a very successful model. Much more has to be done, especially at the micro level. And since last year at COP23, we created together with the G20 countries and the most vulnerable countries of the world, the V20, a new global partnership on insurance mechanism, which we call Global Partnership for Disaster Risk Finance and Insure Resilience. So this is one of the innovative financial models. And this afternoon, when I was at one of the workshops, again, the insurance industry was present and made a plea, by the way, and we have to take this into account, that they would be able even to invest more if countries by themselves would create the type of regulatory framework that is needed in order to even mobilize more private capital for resilience and adaptation for climate change.
So thank you, Ingrid. I think that actually highlights one of the values of Innovate for Climate, where we want to bring both the public and private sector together in order to see what we can do to stimulate more of this financial investment. The European Union Commission is going to come up with some financial sector guidelines towards the end of May with legislative proposals on sustainable finance. What do you see as the most important priorities, and what do you see as the implications for the financial sector going forward?
Thank you, John. It's actually tomorrow when the Commission will present its proposals. And it's important that the Commission puts these proposals forward now, because next year in May we have elections in Europe. So it's 1 year of a window of opportunity to really get some basic requirements installed in the European financial sector. So there are things which are rather basic. What is green? I think in order to get clarity for investors and those who really put forward into the market financial products, we need something which we call taxonomy. So that, in a very complex area, cannot be something where we just get a solution in one go. But it's important that we give orientation on what is green and what is probably not green. There will be a lot of gray areas between green and brown, but at least you need to give it a first try to get it out. That needs to be just be combined with transparency. This morning I said radical transparency, so that those who invest have a basis against which they assess where they want to invest in. So that is an issue which just buys us some time for having a process within the private sector interaction with regulatory authorities on what we need to really regulate that market. The third element will be increased fiduciary responsibilities of those who set up green bonds, about banks who inform investors what products they need to buy, and for financial regulatory authorities. Our financial regulatory authority, the BaFin, the Bundesamt for Financial Regulation, started a process with those who they oversee, and just the questions change the perspective, and I think we need to take the next step. This morning we had a big discussion, and probably I would argue that the financial sector is divided about that, on whether we need regulation. I argue that we need a combination of incentives and openness for the financial sector to develop these things, because we cannot foresee all the developments. But on the other hand, I think we need to have clear regulation as well. We have regulation in other important areas, and therefore I think we need to at least have some kind of framework regulation which requires those who set up financial instruments, banks, insurers, to disclose certain kind of information in order to get the process rolling. So I think that is a most welcome innovation in the European sector. There will be advisory groups of the private sector advising the regulators and the public sector in getting it right. It's not something which we will just do within 1 year, but I argue that we need to get the first steps done within this year. And it is most important because by this we spur a dialogue between us, the climate community, the development community, with private finance, and I think that's exactly the translation service we need to deliver in making the NDCs reality and making what we aspire the world to be a reality for investors to be part of the solution.
Great, thank you, Karsten. I think that gives us a wonderful transition to my final question, or second to final question for Ingrid, and that has got to do with the NDCs. We know each of the countries has prepared these NDCs, but right now they're just paper. The reality comes when it's translated into policies, investment, and finance sitting behind it. So what innovative things are going on? What partnerships are in place? What can be done to mobilize more financing to support NDC implementation?
Yeah, I think it's really absolutely key for the Paris Agreement that the NDCs are being translated from the paper into something that becomes reality. The first thing I heard this afternoon actually is in some countries the NDCs have been elaborated by environment ministries. The first thing is actually to move it into more the center of government doing, which means we have to involve finance ministries, planning ministries, those that actually interact with the finance industry and the private sector. And additionally, and this was another plea by private actors this afternoon on the NDC process, is they would like to sit at the table. So we have to open up the dialogue, not only interact between the Ministry of Finance and other sectoral ministries, but we have to create a space, a platform where we can bring in investors. For instance, we have learned that some investors are interested to invest into sustainable agriculture. So how can this be translated into higher ambition of commitments over time? What is already going on, for instance, under the NDC partnership, and I found this quite actually incentivizing to do more. Costa Rica has made a pledge. They would like to transform the whole transport sector and turn it into a carbon neutral sector. So this is a huge undertaking and requires huge investments. So they have started really to speak to the private sector from the very beginning. So sectoral plans, of course, are being elaborated with your technical support by the World Bank, by the IDB and other bilateral donors. But finally, what counts most is that we get a sense what does the private sector needs in order to come in and to mobilize additional capital. In Uganda, we have already created a huge platform to speak to all donors. Uganda still is a very donor-dependent country. They have a huge number of refugees coming from South Sudan. So they really have they're struggling really to implement an ambitious NDC. But Uganda, for instance, has been at the front of implementing a new regulatory framework to invest in renewable energies, and Germany has been a partner in this endeavor. But how can we make sure that they stay on course and that more private investors come in? What we have to do is actually, in some countries, we have to de-risk. We create mechanisms that de-risk the whole financial sector, and the private sector can come in. We have been working with Uganda to do this by, for instance, first loss concepts, or by providing some securities for local currency investments. Things that are needed so that private sector feel that they are really engaged on a long-term investment. The transformation into a low-carbon economy requires long-term investments. We are therefore the marathon, not for a sprint. But in order to do so, we really have to create the right framework conditions. And the NDC partnership is trying to convince governments and to bring the support, the capacity that is needed in order to shape the right policies and the frameworks for this action.
Very good. Before I come with my one question that will create maybe a little bit of controversy here, let me ask one final one to Karsten. Very quickly, given everything we've talked about, what do you see as the top 3 priorities for the multilateral development banks to move this agenda forward?
I think the first one is that you design products where you secure investment or guarantee investments of the private sector. So basically that you leverage much further development. Secondly, I think that you are playing a pivotal role in mainstreaming the climate and SDG agenda into the policies of planning and finance ministry within your partner countries. And thirdly, probably you should try to be even more innovative than you are. you should not crowd out the private sector, but you should go where there is no private sector yet, and just with your strength in securing and opening up markets, plus your capacity building component, just to conquer new territories. I think that's my wish. And of course, you should be overall coherent, probably better than most of the governments, so that you're not just proud about just being at 28% of climate finance, but that you be very consistent throughout your whole portfolio. And I think you're striving to that. So you should be a role model for the world. That's why you founded you.
Great. Well, excellent. Thank you very much. Interestingly, that comes, you could have written it out of our update that we recently sent to the board in terms of the direction in which we're trying to go. So obviously, now for the question, and I'm going to fall into the trap. They say a lawyer should never ask a question unless they know what the answer is. So I have a question for both of you, and it relates to this weekend. Okay? Question is, Frankfurt or Munich? There was an event last year in Barcelona. One of the key speakers was from Madrid in Barcelona, and he was celebrating the recent soccer result. So I'm going to put each of you on the spot. Ingrid, Frankfurt or Munich?
Frankfurt, I was really...
You were genuinely happy. All right.
I was really... No, because I studied nearby in Gießen, and I lived a couple of years in Frankfurt, and I still read the Frankfurter Rundschau, and so my heart is still with Frankfurt, so I was so glad.
So one for the underdog.
Clearly Frankfurt, because Frankfurt is what we see in the real world as well. Bayern has the money. They have been successful in the past, but and they are just a traditional growth model by buying off all the credits of good German and international soccer players to dominate the market. While Frankfurt clearly showed that it's about innovation, a good strategic plan, and just having a game plan on what a 2050 strategy to be successful in new markets. And I think Frankfurt did the job last Saturday, and if Frankfurt could do that against Bayern Munich, we can do that just for the whole world. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So I think this demonstrates two things. The first is, Karsten has just by analogy explained the logic of tomorrow's summit, including the discussion on disruptive technologies. So great job on that. And the second thing is, no matter how hard I try, I can't stir any dissent or any division between BMZ and BMU. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the evening.